The shared wall of my new apartment always felt a bit too thin, but I never imagined that the hollow sound I heard when I knocked on the drywall was actually the sound of a hidden corridor. I had moved into the building 3 weeks ago, lured by the cheap rent and the beautiful exposed brick. Yet there was always an unsettling stillness in the hallway that made the hair on my arms stand up whenever I came home late from my shift. My neighbor in 4B was a quiet man who never seemed to leave his unit, and the only time I ever saw him was a brief glimpse of his pale, unblinking eyes through the cracked door as I hauled my groceries past his entrance. It was a rainy Tuesday night when I decided to finally hang the heavy mirror my mother had given me, and as the drill bit sank into the plaster of my bedroom wall, it didn't hit a stud or even secondary insulation, but instead, it simply slipped into an empty void that felt much larger than a standard wall cavity. I pulled the drill back and noticed a strange, dark residue on the tip of the metal bit that smelled faintly of old iron and something sweet like rotting fruit. Curiosity is a dangerous thing when you are alone in a quiet building at 2 in the morning, but I couldn't stop myself from widening the hole just enough to peer through with my phone's flashlight. At first, all I saw was darkness, but as my eyes adjusted, I realized I was looking through a double-paned glass window that had been built into the very structure of the wall, hidden behind my wallpaper and his bookshelf. On the other side was a room that looked like a surgical suite, lit by a single, flickering fluorescent bulb that hummed with a low, vibrating energy that I could feel in my own chest. The walls over there weren't painted. They were covered in thick, industrial plastic sheeting that was stapled roughly to the studs, and in the center of the room sat a heavy wooden chair with leather restraints bolted to the arms. My breath hitched in my throat as I saw the floor, which was slightly slanted toward a central drain that looked like it had been freshly scrubbed, yet still held a dark, crimson tint in the grout. I wanted to look away, to run out of the apartment and never come back. But then I saw the movement in the corner of the frame and my entire body froze into a block of ice. My neighbor was standing there, his back to the glass, slowly sharpening a long, curved blade on a whetstone with a rhythmic, scraping sound that seemed to sync up with my own panicked heartbeat. He wasn't wearing his usual oversized sweater. Instead, he was clad in a heavy rubber apron, and he was talking to someone who wasn't there, his voice a low, gravelly whisper that drifted through the thin gaps in the construction. "She's finally home," he muttered, and the realization hit me like a physical blow that he was talking about me, that he had been listening to my every move through this very wall for the last 21 days. I realized then that the mirror I was trying to hang was meant to be the final seal on my own coffin, a way to hide the hole he had already prepared to come through. I slowly began to back away from the wall, trying to keep my footsteps silent on the hardwood floors, but my heel caught on the edge of the rug and I stumbled, my shoulder hitting the heavy dresser with a dull thud that sounded like a gunshot in the silent room. The scraping sound on the other side of the wall stopped instantly. I held my breath, my lungs burning, praying that he would think it was just the building settling or a stray cat outside on the fire escape. But then I heard it, the slow, deliberate sound of footsteps walking toward the hidden window, and I knew he was putting his face right where mine had been just seconds ago. I saw the beam of his own flashlight cut through the hole I had drilled, a tiny circle of light dancing across my bedroom ceiling like a searchlight looking for a fugitive. I dove under the bed, my heart hammering so hard I was certain he could hear it through the floorboards, and I watched the tiny hole in the wall with wide, terrified eyes. A muffled, scratching sound began, the sound of a screwdriver working against the drywall from his side, and I realized he wasn't going to wait for me to fall asleep. He knew I had seen his secret, and the predator was now coming to claim the prey before it could escape the trap. I scrambled out from under the bed, grabbing my keys and my phone, but as I reached for the front door, I heard the heavy deadbolt of his own apartment door slide open in the hallway. He wasn't coming through the wall. He was coming through the front door to cut off my only exit, knowing that the hallway was a narrow bottleneck where I had nowhere to run. I retreated into the kitchen, grabbing the largest knife I had, my hands slick with sweat as I looked at the window leading to the fire escape. It was painted shut, a common problem in these old buildings, and as I yanked on the handle, the wood groaned but refused to budge even an inch. Behind me, I heard the floorboards in the hallway creak, a slow and rhythmic sound that told me he was taking his time, savoring the fear he knew I was feeling. He was playing with his food, moving with the confidence of a man who had done this many times before and knew exactly which exits were blocked and which doors were flimsy. I grabbed a heavy cast iron skillet from the stove and smashed it against the window frame with all the strength my terror-fueled muscles could muster. The sound of shattering glass was deafening, and I didn't care about the noise anymore. I just needed to get out into the cool night air. I heard his footsteps accelerate into a run, the heavy thud of his boots hitting the carpet right outside my door, and then the sound of my own front door being kicked with such force that the frame splintered. I lunged through the broken window, the jagged glass tearing at my sleeves and scratching my forearms, but I didn't feel the pain as I landed hard on the metal grating of the fire escape. The rain was coming down in sheets now, making the metal stairs slippery and treacherous as I scrambled down toward the alleyway. I looked up and saw his pale face appearing in the broken window, his eyes wide with a manic, frustrated energy as he realized I was slipping through his fingers. He didn't scream or shout. He simply climbed out after me with a terrifying, silent efficiency that made me realize he was much faster than he looked. I reached the bottom of the first flight and realized the drop ladder was stuck, rusted into place by decades of neglect and layers of cheap city paint. I was trapped 12 feet above the concrete alley, and he was already halfway down the first set of stairs, the long blade in his hand gleaming under the amber glow of the streetlights. I began to kick at the release lever of the ladder, my boots slipping on the wet metal, while he descended closer and closer, his breath coming in long, ragged gasps that sounded like a dying engine. Just as his hand reached out to grab my ankle through the grating, the rusty pins snapped and the ladder plummeted down with a screeching metallic wail. I slid down the rails, my palms burning from the friction, and hit the ground so hard that the impact vibrated through my teeth. I didn't look back as I sprinted toward the mouth of the alley, my lungs screaming for air as I reached the main street where a late-night diner was still lit up like a sanctuary. I burst through the glass doors, collapsing onto the tile floor as the startled patrons looked on in confusion at the bleeding, drenched woman who was pointing frantically back toward the darkness of the alley. When the police arrived and searched for B, they didn't just find the room with the plastic sheeting. They found a collection of journals detailing the lives of every person who had lived in my apartment for the last 10 years. He had been a ghost in the walls, a silent observer of a dozen different lives, waiting for the perfect moment to turn his dark discovery into a final act. I never went back to get my things, leaving every memory of that place behind, because I knew that even though he was behind bars, the sound of a hollow wall would always make me wonder who was watching from the other side. I moved to a small house in the suburbs where the neighbors are 100 feet away and the walls are made of solid brick. But sometimes, when the house is quiet and the wind is high, I find myself walking to the center of the room and knocking on the wall, just to make sure that the only thing on the other side is the cold, honest silence of the night. The industrial district at 3 in the morning is a graveyard of rusted iron and broken glass, a place where the streetlights flicker with a dying orange hum that barely cuts through the heavy coastal fog. I was driving home after a double shift at the warehouse, my eyes burning from the strain of 12 hours under fluorescent lights, when I felt a sudden, violent rhythmic thudding coming from my rear driver's side tire. It wasn't just a flat. It felt like the entire axle was screaming in protest, forcing me to pull my sedan into the shadows of an abandoned bottling plant just to keep from spinning out into the concrete pylons. I stepped out into the biting cold, the silence of the district pressing against my ears like a physical weight, and that was when I saw him, a man in a grease-stained jumpsuit appearing from the darkness of a side alley, as if he had been waiting for the exact moment my car failed. He didn't have a tow truck or a shop, just a small metal toolbox and a smile that didn't reach his eyes, which remained fixed on me with an intensity that made my stomach do a slow, nauseating flip. "Rough night for a breakdown," he said, his voice a low rasp that sounded like sandpaper on wood, and before I could even reach for my phone to call for a real service, he was already kneeling by my tire with a lug wrench in his hand. I stood back, my hand gripping the flashlight so tight my knuckles turned white, watching as he worked with a speed that felt practiced and predatory. He kept talking, asking me small, probing questions about where I worked, what time I usually drove this route, and if anyone was waiting for me at home. his eyes darting up to catch my reaction every time I hesitated. I tried to give vague answers, my internal alarm screaming that something was fundamentally wrong, but I felt trapped by the social obligation of his help and the fact that my car was currently immobilized on a jack. He finished the job in record time, wiped his hands on a rag that looked more like it was covered in old blood than motor oil, and refused to take any money, insisting that neighbors look out for each other, even though I lived 10 miles away. I thanked him through a dry throat and climbed back into the safety of my locked cabin, watching him disappear back into the fog through my rearview mirror as I pulled away. But as I drove, the car felt different, heavier somehow, and a strange, intermittent beeping began to emanate from somewhere beneath the dashboard that I had never heard before. I pulled into a well-lit gas station 5 miles down the road, my heart racing as I grabbed a tire iron and crouched down to look at the undercarriage of my vehicle. My breath caught in my throat when I saw it. A small, black plastic box with a magnetic strip and a tiny, pulsing green light tucked deep into the wheel well where the mechanic had been working just minutes ago. It wasn't a repair. It was a GPS tracker, and as I stared at the blinking light, I realized with a jolt of pure electricity that he wasn't just a passerby, but a hunter who had likely sabotaged my car blocks away just to see where I would stop. I ripped the tracker off the metal frame and threw it into the back of a passing dump truck, hoping to lead him on a ghost chase, but as I turned to get back in my car, I saw a pair of headlights pull into the far corner of the gas station lot. It was a beat-up black SUV with no front license plate, the engine idling with a deep, menacing growl that seemed to vibrate the very air around me. I didn't wait to see who was behind the wheel. I threw my car into gear and floored it, the tires screeching as I tore back onto the main road, my eyes glued to the mirror. The SUV followed, keeping a consistent distance of 3 car lengths, mirroring every lane change and every burst of speed I attempted on the empty midnight streets. I realized then that he didn't need the tracker anymore. He had me in his sights, and the industrial district was a maze of dead ends and gated yards that he clearly knew better than I did. I tried to head toward the police station, but he surged forward, his heavy bumper clipping my rear fender and sending me fishtailing toward a row of shipping containers that lined the shipyard. He was trying to pit maneuver me, to flip my car and trap me in the wreckage before I could reach help, his headlights blinding me as he moved from side to side like a wolf nipping at the heels of a tired deer. I saw a narrow gap between 2 massive crates that led toward the pier, a path too small for his wide SUV but just wide enough for my sedan if I didn't care about the paint. I yanked the steering wheel to the right, the sound of metal screaming against metal echoing through the night as I squeezed through the gap, leaving behind my side mirror and a trail of sparks. I heard the heavy thud of his vehicle slamming into the containers behind me, the sound of his engine revving in a frustrated roar as he realized he was stuck. I didn't slow down, driving through the maze of the shipyard until I reached the main gate where the night security guard was already standing outside with a radio in his hand, alerted by the noise. I tumbled out of the car, gasping for air, the adrenaline finally leaving my system and leaving me shaking so hard I could barely stand. The police found the black SUV abandoned 3 blocks away, the engine still warm and the interior filled with rolls of duct tape, heavy-duty zip ties, and a notebook containing the license plate numbers of a dozen different women who worked the night shift in that district. He had been a predator of the shadows, using his knowledge of cars to create accidents that would leave his victims vulnerable and alone in the dark. I never take that route home anymore, and I never ever stop for a stranger offering help in the middle of the night, because I know that sometimes the person who fixes your problem is the one who created it in the first place. Every time I hear a strange noise from my engine or see a car following a little too closely in the rain, I feel that cold phantom weight of the GPS tracker in my hand, reminding me how close I came to disappearing into the fog. I keep a light on in the driveway now, and I check my wheel wells every single morning, because the midnight mechanic is still out there somewhere, waiting for the next car to break down in the dark. The package had been sitting on my porch for 3 days, a plain cardboard box that I assumed was just another impulse buy from a late-night scrolling session until I saw the return address was a defunct electronics warehouse in a state I had never even visited. I finally brought it inside and sliced through the heavy packing tape, revealing a used dash cam that looked like it had been dragged across a gravel road. its plastic casing scarred and the lens covered in a thin, greasy film. There was no manual and no charger, just a high-capacity memory card already slotted into the side. And as someone who spends 4 hours a day commuting on dangerous rural highways, I figured a free camera was better than no camera at all. I plugged the device into my laptop to clear the old files, but the moment the folder window popped up, I realized the previous owner hadn't deleted a single second of their final journey. The thumbnails were all time-stamped from exactly 1 week ago, and as I clicked the most recent file, the high-definition video filled my screen with the sight of a familiar stretch of Highway 12, the very same road I take to get to my house every single night. The audio was crisp, capturing the sound of a woman humming along to the radio, her voice light and unsuspecting, until a pair of high-intensity LED headlights appeared in the rearview reflection on the camera's internal screen. The vehicle behind her was a massive, rusted tow truck with a heavy steel push bar on the front, and it wasn't just following her. It was mimicking her every move with a terrifying, synchronized precision. Every time she sped up, the truck surged forward, staying inches from her bumper, and every time she slowed down, the truck would loom over her small hatchback like a metallic predator preparing to strike. I watched the screen with a growing sense of dread as the woman's humming stopped, replaced by the sound of her jagged, panicked breathing and the frantic clicking of her door locks as she realized she was being hunted. "Please, just go around," she whispered, her voice trembling so violently that I could almost feel her fear vibrating through my own desk chair. The truck didn't go around. Instead, it began to ram her, the camera jarring and tilting with every impact, capturing the sparks flying from her exhaust pipe as the heavy steel bar ground against her trunk. The chase went on for 10 miles, passing landmarks I recognized with chilling clarity. The old water tower, the closed-down bait shop, and finally, the entrance to the very gravel driveway where I was currently sitting. My heart stopped when the video showed her turning into my driveway, her tires throwing up stones as she desperately tried to reach the house to find help, but the tow truck was faster. The video ended abruptly with a deafening crash of breaking glass and a sudden, sickening silence that was only broken by the sound of a heavy boots crunching on the gravel outside the car door. I sat there in the dark of my office, the blue light of the laptop screen reflecting off my eyes, realizing that the used camera hadn't been sold to me by a warehouse, but had been sent to me as a trophy or a warning. A sudden, sharp beam of light cut through my living room window, sweeping across the walls and landing directly on the box the camera had arrived in. I dove to the floor, my pulse thundering in my ears, and crawled toward the window to peer through the corner of the blinds. Sitting at the end of my long, isolated driveway was a massive, rusted tow truck, its engine idling with a low, guttural growl that seemed to shake the very foundation of the house. The driver didn't get out. He just sat there with his high beams on, illuminating my front door as if he was waiting for me to acknowledge that I had finished watching the footage. I scrambled for my phone, but the screen was dead, the battery drained by a sudden, inexplicable surge that had left the device hot to the touch. I realized then that he had likely used a signal jammer, a common tool for high-end thieves and stalkers who didn't want their victims calling for a rescue that would never arrive. I was 3 miles from the nearest neighbor, and the sun wouldn't be up for another 5 hours, leaving me trapped in a wooden box while a predator waited patiently on the porch. I heard the sound of the truck's door creaking open, followed by the slow, deliberate thud of heavy boots hitting the gravel, moving toward the side of the house instead of the front door. He was looking for a secondary entrance, a weak point in the old construction that he could exploit without making too much noise. I moved through the kitchen in total darkness, my bare feet silent on the linoleum, and grabbed the heavy iron fire poker from beside the wood stove. The scratching started at the laundry room door, a thin, wooden barrier with a simple glass pane that wouldn't hold up against a determined kick. I could hear him breathing through the wood, a wet, rattling sound that made my skin crawl with a primal revulsion. He wasn't rushing. He was savoring the hunt, confident that I had nowhere to run and no way to tell the world what was happening in the shadows of the rural woods. I knew I couldn't win a physical fight against someone that size, so I did the only thing I could think of to break his concentration and create a gap for escape. I reached into the utility closet and grabbed a can of heavy-duty degreaser, spraying a thick, slick layer of the chemical across the linoleum floor just inside the laundry room door. Then, I stood back in the shadows of the hallway and waited. My breath held until my lungs felt like they were going to burst. The glass shattered with a sharp, crystalline pop, and a gloved hand reached through the jagged hole to turn the deadbolt from the inside. The door swung open, and the man stepped into the room, his heavy boots instantly losing their grip on the chemical-slicked floor. He went down hard, his head hitting the edge of the washing machine with a hollow, metallic clang that echoed through the house. He wasn't unconscious, but he was disoriented, scrambling like a panicked animal as he tried to find purchase on the slippery surface. I didn't wait for him to recover. I lunged forward and slammed the heavy laundry room door shut, sliding the external bolt that I had installed years ago to keep the dogs out of the mudroom. He roared in frustration, throwing his shoulder against the door with a force that made the hinges groan. But the bolt held. I ran to the living room, grabbed my car keys, and sprinted out the front door, not stopping to look back at the tow truck that blocked the main path. I didn't take my car. Instead, I sprinted into the dense woods behind the house, following a narrow deer trail that I knew led to the old logging road a mile away. I could hear him behind me, crashing through the underbrush with a reckless, violent energy, his flashlight beam cutting through the trees like a jagged blade. But I knew these woods better than any stranger ever could, and I moved through the darkness by touch, navigating the roots and the thorns until I reached the logging road where a local patrol car was parked, the officer inside finishing his nightly paperwork. When the police returned to the house, the tow truck was gone, but they found the dash cam still plugged into my laptop and the memory card missing. He had doubled back to take the evidence, but he had left behind a single, muddy fingerprint on the laundry room door that matched a man wanted for a string of highway disappearances in 3 different states. I moved to the city the following week, trading the quiet of the country for the safety of streetlights and neighbors, but I still can't drive at night without checking my rearview mirror every 10 seconds. Every time I see a pair of high-intensity LED headlights behind me, I feel that same cold, hollow dread in the pit of my stomach. And I never, ever buy used electronics anymore, because I know that some stories aren't meant to be shared, and some discoveries are better left buried in the dark.